Thank you, everybody, and I'm delighted to be here today. My name's Penny van Bergen. I'm head of school in the School of Education at the University of Wollongong. What our panel is going to be talking about is the developing mind. And so I think, taking some of the previous sort of insights about brain development, what we're really interested in this session is where do we start off? What do we know about our genetics? What seems to be individual differences that we're born with? And what are things that are shaped by parenting, by our schooling system, and what does that mean for us as individuals? And so what you're going to is a rich kind of overlapping of cognitive approaches, of neuroscientific approaches, of behavioural and social approaches to understand what it is that makes us us when we're first born and who we become as adults. And I think if you think about who you were as a child, the sorts of inputs that you had as a sort of, a baby from birth, moving through your schooling, moving through your family life, moving out into the world, what is it that makes you you? What is it that was shaped by your environment? What is it that you think, look, I'm actually not sure where that comes from. Nobody in my family knows. This is just something that's me. So in our session, we're going to start with Professor Adam Guastella, who's going to be talking about some of the neuroscience that underpins our development and some of the ways in which we can track neurotypical and neurodivergent development. Professor Sharynne McLeod is going to be talking about Professor Sharynne McLeod is going to be talking about language and communication development, the things that come naturally to us, but also where we might have difficulties and what that means and how we can address those. Professor Anne Castles is going to be talking about reading development and how we interact with the education system, what it means when we have how we can address that. And finally, Associate Professor Highfield is going to be talking about our interaction with the digital world, what that means for us as people interacting with the kinds of cognitive tasks that we experience in the world and how we encounter that. Now, we have planned to talk in chronological order, sort of starting from infancy and moving up through childhood, but we've actually got a lot of overlap here, and that's because we are developing in multifaceted ways constantly. So what you're going to see is an overlap of methodologies, an overlap of domains, but also some distinctiveness in the sorts of things that we focus on. And also this kind of interplay constantly between nature and nurture, but sometimes interactions where we're not quite sure where those come from. And this real focus on what it is that makes all of us human, but also what it is that makes us individuals. I might invite the panel to come up, and I'll give a little bit of an introduction to each of the panel members as they begin their spiel. So we've got about 10 minutes for each panel member to talk. And then after that, there's some time for Q&A. We'll have about half an hour for questions and answers. So could I ask everybody to come up onto the stage, and we might start from here. Okay, I'm delighted to invite Professor Adam Guastella to give his presentation. Adam is a clinical psychologist with an established track record in human translational neuroscience. This research has led him to study the neurobiology of social behaviour. He's particularly focused on development in the early life and methods that can support early development and intervention. He builds collaborative partnerships between researchers, clinicians and services to ensure that children and their families receive the best available assessments and treatment to support wellbeing. He's the co-lead of the Child Neurodevelopment and Mental Health team at the University of Sydney, who aim to solve complex problems for children with neurodevelopmental conditions and families, taking a multidisciplinary approach. He's also director of the Clinic for Autism and Neurodevelopment Research. So please welcome Adam. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Penny, and thank you for the invitation to present today and to listen to such wonderful speakers and multidisciplinary research today. So one of the things that Dr. Gordon talked about, and I've heard repeatedly, is the future of science really is about data. It's really about the quality of the data that we can collect moving forward. I studied as a clinical psychologist, and neuroscience was largely in the dungeons of psychology departments with amazing outcomes, amazing studies, but largely confined away from the clinics. The future of research, the future of neuroscience is in the clinic with the patients, with their concerns, with their needs, and using precision medicine to guide the assessments and treatments that we provide for them. I'm going to use child development as a way to understand this. You see, there's a massive need in our community. The NDIS is a $30 billion industry to the Australian government. 36% of those children in the NDIS have a diagnosis of autism, but the research behind neurodevelopment and autism is very poor. I could give you one book on a shelf to cover the amount of evidence we have for how we assess and how we provide support to kids with autism, and that has to change. And we know through the work at Sydney University and across our many community partners that kids are on wait lists for way too long just to get a basic assessment. You see, on average, children wait 3.5 years from the time caregivers notice a delay to the point of getting their assessment. 88% of caregivers know there is a concern by the time children start school, but can't get a neurodevelopment assessment. We need to change the science, we need to change the practices behind how we do assessments and provide supports to families. It's a national emergency. The problem is the current assessments that we have are incredibly complicated, require specialised care and lots of training by really wonderful and excellent therapists, allied health, medical staff. Most assessments take at least a full day to get a really good understanding of child neurodevelopment. But there are fundamental building blocks of what we're looking for to try and detect and understand child development. And we can do a much better job of trying to detect delays using 21st century approaches. You see, it shouldn't be all about a diagnosis. Much of the research we've done recently has shown the fundamental things that, if you like, diverge in brain development are not unique to a diagnosis. We've found that, for example, executive function delays are common across all neurodevelopmental conditions. There's very few unique markers that predict a specific type of neurodevelopmental condition. And this brain divergence that occurs, or this delay in executive function skills and attention skills, seems to emerge by the age of 2 to 3 and get larger by ages 4 and 5 across diagnoses. So the question is, how can we develop markers that better assess neurodevelopmental delay without getting caught up necessarily in a specific diagnosis? And we know parents report huge needs for services. So we know that the vast majority of parents experience huge wait lists to get care. They report financial barriers to access specialists to provide that care, and they don't know where to go. Despite this, about 50% of families across all of our community health clinics want digital tools and digital supports and training programs to support their child and training for them to know what to do. So what we've done is we've established really the largest neurodevelopment research network in Australia, collecting data from firstly hospital-based clinics, but also community-based clinics of the most vulnerable families entering services seeking assessments for their children. And what we're seeking to do is to try and develop, using evidence-based data gathering procedures, methods to track and to support families using digital tools. This means that we're giving access to research to the most vulnerable members of our society. Clinicians can use this research to access reports and data calculations almost immediately to speed up the time they have to provide feedback to families. And we can provide clinical trials to families, personalised care methods almost immediately. So families that typically are excluded from clinical trials are now getting access to clinical trials through our research network. In just 1 year of functioning, we've had over 2,000 children enter the database for research of vulnerable families, 50% from cultural and linguistically diverse families. These are families that typically never get into research databases, never get into research that guides evidence base for the federal government and for state governments. And we've become very proactive in highlighting needs. So, for example, we know that we've been very active in showing the huge delays to diagnosis, but also that families prefer digital tools when completing their assessments. So we know that 88% of families much prefer digital tools to pencil and paper tests, that when families use digital tools, their completion rate jumps from 36% up to 90%. So that means clinics are getting more effective data more immediately. Clinicians are getting the data faster to provide feedback to families, and families prefer the immediacy of the data collection methods. So now what we're doing is looking at how we can use the digital world with neuroscience to create real impact. Can we integrate the data collection methods into everyday practices, daily living, what the kids do on a daily basis? And I believe we're only at the start of this journey. In years to come, neuroscience will come to the fore and guide the way for science to drive real change. There's an opportunity for neuroscience that it's never had in the past, and that is using data in the real world to guide practice through the tracking of systems and circuits. So to give you one example, we've been tracking, for example, reading in young children and how young children interact with the daily pastime of reading books with their caregivers. And we've been using eye tracking methodologies to understand how that practice might impact on learning and development and might also predict child neurodevelopmental delays. Interestingly enough, I'll just go back. These paradigms have been incredibly powerful to show early divergence in attention to reading and to the caregiver's face predicts neurodevelopmental diagnosis independent of a specific diagnosis like autism. So we're now able to use these very common daily tasks that caregivers have with their children to start to detect delays in children and possibly in the future to intervene. We've been working really closely with our engineering colleagues to video record every assessment that's conducted in the clinic and to try and to develop biomarkers just through observation rather than clinicians having to spend an hour and a half with families to try and to develop some algorithmic score of what they observe. We're using algorithms developed by AI to generate these scores independently. And what we've been able to show is that using things like joint attention and eye gaze and facial movement, we can differentiate between a neurodevelopmental diagnosis with 90% accuracy immediately at the point of an interaction. And this means that families will get answers in the future about delay for their children and their interactions faster than ever before. And now we're using this data to guide how we refer families and children into different therapies. So we heard about the potential of gut therapeutics, and we've been involved in an international studies looking at the potential of gut therapeutics to reduce irritability in children with neurodevelopmental delays. We've currently done a lot of work around oxytocin and potential of the love hormone, and I contend that there's much more to love than the brain. Involved in social development. And we've been looking at how children learn in their social environment, if you like, engage in social learning over time using these data collection algorithms so that if children don't respond to the immediacy of therapy, we can use biological or targeted therapies to increase their response. We can make sure that children get what they need out of therapy using biosignals. This is a snapshot of what we're doing, and I guess it flips into a lot of what Joshua Gordon talked about in relation to psychosis. But we have the opportunity in Australia through our wonderful public health system to do something more immediate that accesses the most vulnerable families in our society and really to lead the way in progressing change in child neurodevelopment. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Adam, and we'll save questions until the end of all of the speakers. I'm delighted now to introduce Professor Sharynne McLeod, who is a Professor of Speech and Language Acquisition at Sturt University. Sharynne's work on communication rights and children's speech development and disorders across languages has changed children's lives and impacted health and education professionals worldwide. She's a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences of Australia, a Fellow of the Royalist Society of New South Wales, and founding Editor-in-Chief of the International Journal of Speech Language Pathology. She was the first international affiliate to receive honours for the American Speech Language Hearing Association and is a life member of the Speech Pathology Australia. The Australian newspaper has named Sharynne as Australia's research field leader in audiology, speech and language pathology in 2018, 19, 20 and 2022, and best in the world based on the quality, volume and impact of her work in 2019 and 2023. Please welcome Sharynne.
Thank you so much for the absolute honour to be here today. Thank you, Dr. Pond, I'm so sorry, Dr. Pond, members and fellows of the Academies and the Royal Society of New South Wales, fellow presenters and guests. I acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands on which we meet today. Pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Indigenous people who are joining us today. I thank our First Nations people for their ongoing custodianship of the land, culture and languages of our country. I'm deeply honoured to speak with you today about a topic that's so important to me, but also to you, the ability to communicate. I invite you to stop and think just for a moment about how the ability to communicate comes so naturally and easily for us. We don't even think about it, that we are spending a day talking. It's like the air we breathe. We only notice it if it's not there. The work of myself and my PhD student Kate Margetson, Kate please wave, and our team really focus on those people whose voices are not heard. Communication is central to all people and all societies. Our ability to communicate impacts our identity, our relationships, our education, employment, self-determination and engagement in community, social and civic life. Our nation's prosperity, health, well-being and security requires successful communication. Communication is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations. It mediates children's behaviour, their learning and their socialisation. There's a strong link between children's communication ability and their educational, social and their occupational outcomes. There's a strong link between their future behaviour, mental health issues, and even involvement with the criminal justice system. Communication typically involves a sound or word travelling between speakers and listeners, moving from the brain to the mouth, to the ear to the brain. Or in the case of sign languages, gesture and facial expressions, this pathway is the brain, the hand or face, the eye and the brain. Communication is hardwired in our brains and our bodies. The brain controls speech, language, hearing and communication, and I'm not sure, but if you notice the previous speakers all had regions of the brain for speech and language and hearing. A few of these include the temporal lobe that controls language comprehension, hearing and memory. The frontal lobe controls both motor and executive functions that are essential for communication, that include planning, processing, problem solving and judgment. The parietal lobe controls sensory perception and integration, including our hearing. The occipital lobe interprets vision, including facial recognition and other skills that are really essential for successful communication. Broca's and Wernicke's areas are responsible for receptive and expressive speech and language, and are typically found in the left hemisphere. The brain processes more sensory and motor information involving the face and the lips and the tongue and the hands than any other body part, as seen in the homunculus model. As I say again, communication is hardwired in our brains and our bodies. The foundations of speech, language and communication are established in early childhood. In fact, even before birth. Even before birth, children can identify their mother's voice from others' voices, and they can even identify their mother's home language from other languages, even before birth. Children typically say their first words at 1 year of age when they take their first steps. They start putting 2 words together around about their second birthdays, and by 3 years of age, they are using grammatical sentences. The role of the environment is extremely important in shaping and supporting children's speech, language and communication growth. We undertook a longitudinal study of 3,547 infants aged 1 to 2 years of age, and found that when parents read with them for 11 minutes or more per day, compared to less than that, parents who read 11 minutes or more a day with these children ended up having stronger reading, spelling and grammar skills in grades 3 and 5. Now, what was the mechanism for that to occur? This is part of the type of things that we are thinking about today. Our team has undertaken studies, and currently we work with over 100 languages and dialects across the world. We have the most incredible colleagues in so many languages and so many countries, and I'm so grateful that they also speak English because they share their incredible knowledge with our team that we collate. We have found in a cross-linguistic study of over 26,000 children that by 4 to 5 years of age, children can be understood by everyone, even strangers, and they can correctly pronounce almost every consonant, vowel, and if they speak a tonal language, tone in their home language by 4 to 5 years of age, by the time they are reaching school. They can also understand and produce sentences, stories, and conversations. Their communicative capacity continues to develop through school and across the lifespan, but the foundations are developed before they reach school. Communication is the key that can unlock and open doors so children can thrive. While most children's communication development is straightforward, a number of children have difficulties communicating. For some, this can be associated with hearing loss or cleft lip and palate, cerebral palsy, or another identifiable cause. But that is only about 10 to 20% of children with speech, language and communication needs. For about 80% of children with speech, language and communication needs, there's currently no known cause. Their communication disability may include speech sound disorder, developmental language disorder, stuttering or voice disorder. We don't know why, and many of our systems, as I'll talk about a little later, are based around children with known causes. We count children's communication disability as secondary to something like hearing loss. We are missing our understanding and knowledge of so many of the children that Kate and I spend our time thinking about and think are extremely precious and know their voices need to be heard. Our team has undertaken longitudinal population research that's demonstrated the impact of communication ability on children's outcomes. Our research has been based on the Australian Government's longitudinal studies, and today I'm going to talk about one particular one, the longitudinal study of Australian children, where they've studied 10,000 children for a long time now, and we've been able to really understand the study was set up for so many different reasons, but there's so much that we can gather about children's communication as well. In this study, there were 25% of parents of 4 to 5 year olds who were concerned about how their child spoke and made speech sounds. Now that seems like a huge amount. There are 2 cohorts in the longitudinal study of Australian children, and again, it was 25% in both cohorts. In the longitudinal study of Indigenous Australian children, it was 24.3%. In equivalent studies in America, it's similarly 25% of parents are concerned. So what we've done is we've had a look at what happens to these kids over time. Now, this is a series of a lot of studies summarised into one slide, but we have found, and we've had a particular cohort of 4,329 Australian children identified through Medicare to represent the Australian population, studied over time. We have found that there's a significant association between parent concern at 4 to 5 years of age and throughout the school years up until the end of high school. It's significantly association with whether children are bullied, a significant association based on the outcome of their peer relationships, their enjoyment of school, their reading, writing, numeracy, school achievement, and teacher-child relationships. And these outcomes were over and above the effects of, say, sex, age, language background, and socioeconomic position. In fact, in a longitudinal study of the same from LSAC, with 8,405 children, we found that children whose parents were concerned about their speech and language skills at 4 to 5 years of age has significantly lower academic achievement on every single NAPLAN subtest, reading, writing, spelling, grammar, and numeracy in years 1, 3 and 5. And similar findings have been reported across the world. And this has nothing to do with multilingualism. We've also looked at what happens with multilingual kids. Now, I don't know if you know, but there's over 7,000 languages in the world. And most children and adults in the world, a much greater percentage, are multilingual than monolingual. Australia is a fairly unusual country. We do have a monolingual mindset. We have learned through this longitudinal study of Australian children that multilingualism does not impact children's educational outcomes. There was no difference between speaking one or more languages on children's language and literacy, mathematical thinking, and socioeconomic skills. It didn't matter how many languages children spoke. In fact, in the longitudinal study of Indigenous children, some children spoke up to 8 languages. How clever are they? What mattered was actually whether parents were concerned about how their child talked and made speech sounds at 4 to 5 years of age. We know that multilingualism is a superpower, and Kate is here next to me being a superhero. During COVID, one of our Australian Research Council grants was ongoing, where we supported Vietnamese English-speaking children and families to maintain their home languages. So we all became superpowers via Zoom, and the children would put their superpower capes on and learn along with us about how to support their home language. And if anybody is interested, we have some really awesome evidence-based resources about how to support children's multilingualism, particularly in Vietnamese, but also in other languages. One of the most foundational problems impacting Australia's social and economic future is the need to support children to become competent communicators, thus reducing the lifetime productivity cost estimated to be $21.7 billion in lost wages for children with speech, language and communication needs. Early identification and provision of communication services in early childhood are essential for changing children's trajectories and much more cost-effective than remediation in later life. There are so many successful evidence-based interventions to support children with speech, language and communication needs. However, the majority of Australian children with speech, language and communication needs are underserved. In fact, over 50% of Australian children with speech, language and communication needs receive no or insufficient communication support due to long speech pathology waiting lists that was identified 10 years ago in an Australian Government Senate inquiry, fragmented services and geographical and linguistic barriers and cost. The New South Wales Health Henry Review described the long waiting list to access speech pathology services for children with speech delay when there's a strong evidence base for the cost benefit of early intervention. When children don't receive adequate early intervention, there can be long-term consequences on their literacy, their education, socialisation, behaviour, relationships, identity, well-being and employment. Thank you to those of you who are here, who are grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, next-door neighbours, who take time to talk with children, to encourage children, to read to children, to explain to children. Your impact and your involvement is so important. Our challenge is to ensure that all children have the best start in life to create a better future for themselves and for the nation. We need to support children's communication to enhance the future for individuals, communities, and our whole society. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Sharynne. I'd like to introduce Professor Anne Castles, and I think you'll see a really nice complementarity between Sharynne and Anne's work. You know, when we're talking about language, communication, literacy, these are sort of operating in the same domain, but what you'll see with Anne's work is not always with the same developmental drivers and not always with the same mechanisms that support development. So Anne Castles is an ARC Australian Laureate Fellow based at the Australian Centre for Advancement of Literacy at the Australian Catholic University. This is a brand new centre and really exciting for people in education to see nationwide work focused on development of literacy. Her research focuses on learning to read in dyslexia. She has learning to read and dyslexia. She has particular interest in the variability within reading of different types of dyslexia, including genetic, cognitive and language factors. She's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and serves on the editorial boards of several journals, including Scientific Studies of Reading, the Journal of Experimental Child Psychology, and she has served as President of Learning Difficulties Australia from 2017 to 2018. So please welcome Anne with me.
I just want to echo my thanks for being invited to this wonderful event. Feels like I've learned about 1 million things already, and we haven't even got to morning tea. As Penny said, I think there's some really interesting commonalities and differences when we talk about language versus reading. So as Sharynne so clearly demonstrated, the general belief is that humans have what we call the language instinct, a innate natural ability, if they are neurotypical, to learn to speak. Children are typically born with this, and it occurs naturally through their interactions with the environment. I think the linguist Steven Pinker gave a very delightful summary of this when he said, short of raising a child in a barrel, they will learn to talk in the environment that they're in. Now, we have a very different situation when we talk about reading. So, if you place a child in the environment of books, and leave them to discover what they discover, what you find is they don't discover very much about reading. We are not hardwired to naturally derive meaning from those squiggles and curves and, funny looking letters that are on the page. So reading is a learned skill. This has come up many times already this morning, and it typically requires instruction. And the very unfortunate thing, and the thing that I have spent so much of my time trying to understand, is that approximately 10 to 15% of children have a specific and long-standing difficulty with learning to read. And these are children who don't have low IQs. There's nothing, quite often no other really obvious feature that would explain it. There is a comorbidity with language difficulties, and I'll move on to that in a moment. But it's a very specific disorder, and we see it in many different forms. Now, I knew I only, only had 10 minutes, and I've noticed that in the media these days there's quite a lot of information that's shared via listicle type things. So I decided I'd take the list approach and sort of share with you the top 5 things that I've learned about dyslexia in the time that I've been studying it. The first thing might seem somewhat surprising, but in the vast majority of cases of dyslexia, the problem is at the word level. There are some unusual, different cases whose problem is at a text type level, a broader comprehension level. Typically those children have other language disorders that go with that. But if we're talking about a dyslexia, a specific reading problem, usually we can locate it at the level of the word, which is something quite valuable for teachers to know, that you can probably just with a few quick word tests get an idea of which child might have a propensity to struggle. Now, in some ways this might seem really surprising, like how easy is that? How easy is it for us to read dog? How could it possibly be such a difficult challenge that some children are unable to fully achieve? But if we break it down, even reading a single word is immensely complex. So for starters, you read this word in an enormous different set of forms. You read words in uppercase and lowercase. You read them in different fonts. You read them in skywriting. It's not just a visual process, it's quite a complex, abstract knowledge of what the spelling of that word is that you can do. The other thing is that you can read words that don't follow the typical sounds that you would sound out. So a child first reading this word would say yatched, and English is a particularly difficult language in that it has very many words like this, and in fact very many words that are quite frequent that are like this. So was, for example, if you sounded it out, you'd get was. So there's a completely separate challenge of committing to a form of memory the spellings of the words that we know, so that you know automatically that that is yacht and not yatched. And we're also able to read novel words. So I can put this made-up word that I've just put on the board for you, and you can instantly pronounce it as glimpse. So you have a separate process in your brain that's doing that, that's computing out the pronunciations of words in most cases and getting to their meaning that way. And of course, even as adults, we have to, read novel words all the time, reading people's names that you don't know, names of towns and cities. I had a international visitor the other day, and I was driving her down to see the harbour and all around here, and she said, "Oh, I really would like to go to Woolloomooloo." And for quite a while I was like, what is she talking about? Then I realised it was Woolloomooloo. But there's a lot of word learning that happens all the way through our life. So as well as being focused at the word level, even at that word level, it's highly heterogeneous. So it's really wrong to talk about dyslexia. We should talk about the dyslexias because it's a complex learned skill, and by that complexity, there's a whole range of different ways in which it can go awry. So just taking our examples from before, if with our 10 to 15% of children in the classroom, some of them we know have difficulties with that sounding out process, which is essential for reading novel words. Very many children with dyslexia have this problem. And it's one of the reasons that there's a big push for phonics instruction that's very systematic and structured and assessed in schools, because you really need to be able to read novel words when you're learning to read. When you're learning to read, every written word's a novel word, right? But you also find children who have difficulty with putting words to memory. So they've seen the same word over and over again. You and I would be familiar with it. We'd go, oh yes, that's yacht, no worries. But they continue to struggle, and they need to see many more exposures in order to be able to put that word to memory. And of course that means that their reading is very slow. They have to devote a lot of resources, cognitive resources, to that processing, which interrupts their ability to comprehend the text, which is obviously the most important thing. You do also get children whose problem is at the comprehension level. So these are often the kinds of kids that Sharynne has talked about. They have difficulties with vocabulary, with spoken language, and that carries through to a difficulty in understanding written text. So really the point that I want to make is, even with what seems the most simple task to us, there's actually, when you break it down, an awful lot of complexity, and all of that complexity is typically mastered by children within a couple of years, amazingly, but we do see these children that struggle, and we need to do more for them. Third thing that I've learned, and this may seem in some ways counter to the point I made earlier that we don't have a reading instinct. You would have noticed that on none of those brain pictures that we've looked at this morning has there been an area of the brain for reading. So we don't have a reading gene, but that doesn't mean that it's not heritable, because what is heritable are the complex set of more general abilities that are heritable that have to be applied to the task of reading. So we're talking about memory, we're talking about visual processing, we're talking about language. And that combination of skills is highly heritable, and it plays out in the dyslexias that you see. The neatest evidence for this, in my view, has come from twin studies. I think most of you would be aware of the logic of twin studies. You know, we have identical twins, sometimes called monozygotic twins, who share 100% of their genes. They're genetically the same. And then, of course, we have our non-identical dizygotic twins who share 50% of their genes. And if they're living within the same family and going to the same school, they're relatively well controlled in terms of their environmental experience. So we can use the contrast between identical and non-identical twins to get an estimate of how heritable reading difficulties are, and not just one type of reading difficulty, but all of the different types of dyslexia that I've mentioned. So the way we would do this, if you just look at the top, there we have a bell curve. Those ones at the bottom there, we would select one twin who is struggling with some reading task, they being in the black little section there. And then what we do is we have a look at what's going on with their co-twin, and look at that in relation to whether they're identical twins or non-identical twins. And what you can clearly see is that when we look at the co-twin of a child with dyslexia, the co-twin in both cases tends to be below the average on the overall bell curve. But you can see that our monozygotic twins are much worse, excuse me, are much worse than the dizygotic twins. So that tells us we can compute essentially a heritability estimate. And these estimates are very high, surprisingly high. Over 50% of reading difficulties are heritable by most estimates. Now, of course, this doesn't mean, and I think this can often be, something that's hard for parents to process or teachers, doesn't mean these reading difficulties can't be treated. We know a lot about how to teach reading, and we know that we can apply those same principles to children with reading difficulties and get good outcomes. We just need to do it more intensively and probably for longer. Again, learning's come up a lot in the sessions so far, and as I've emphasised, dyslexia is a difficulty in learning. So we know much of it is based in genetics somewhere. We know it's happening somewhere in the brain, and many researchers look at exactly that kind of thing. What are the areas of the brain that seem to be different in children with dyslexia? But we can see a causal pathway that goes down to maybe a language processing difficulty that may then go down to a difficulty in learning those letter sound mappings. And then we have an outcome, a behavioural outcome, that's the reading difficulty. So we think there are multiple causal pathways that can lead to reading difficulties. And as I've already emphasised, there's multiple different types of reading difficulties as well. So this is a complex task to try and unpack these causal pathways. One thing we do know, and this is the last thing in my listicle, is that although we know that there's this complex causal pathway, and we researchers spend a lot of time trying to tease these causal pathways out, what we know is that based on the science we have so far, if you have a child with a reading difficulty, the very best focus of your intervention should be at the level of the reading difficulty itself. We just don't know enough about the complex causal pathways that lead to that for intervening at earlier levels to be effective. And of course, there's many cases where we wouldn't be able to intervene, obviously. But what we do know is that if we identify using very carefully evidence-based assessments exactly where a child's problem is and target that, we can have the best outcomes for a child. And this is one of the reasons why we, in my research group, in my clinic and other things we do, always suggest to be a little bit wary of any dyslexia treatment that is focusing at one of those earlier levels. Not that those aren't important questions, but we're just not at the point where that is helpful for intervention. So, brain training, coloured lenses, visual problems, all of those sorts of things. We know there are associations, but we also know from large RCTs that those kinds of interventions are not as effective as working at the level of the reading system itself. So I'll leave it there. I feel a bit sad in a way that I can summarise my whole research career in 5 points, but still. We do still have a lot to learn, and one thing that is absolutely crucial, and what my Laureate project is focusing on, is reading difficulties once children move into secondary school. We know from international reading studies, PISA studies, I think the last estimate from the PISA international study had 40% of 15-year-old Australian children did not meet the criterion for functional literacy. So we've got many, many children who are coming into high school not having been picked up as having a reading difficulty or a language difficulty in primary school. They move into high school where nobody looks at that anymore. No one, there's no literacy teachers, they're not doing that. They're teaching content, and the children are expected to access that content. And we know that a large number of those children can't. And as echoed in the points that Sharynne made, we also know that things get really tricky once you get to this age, because self-esteem issues and anxiety and other sort of comorbid factors often lead to these children being very resistant to reading and to things like school refusal. So what we need to do, and what we hope to do in the 7 years that the ARC has so generously given us, is to not just look at the basics of the reading trajectory in these children in high school, but how it interacts with all of those other contextual factors that are going on in high school. So maybe in 7 years' time, I can come back and tell you some answers. But thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you, Anne. We're going to move to our final speaker, Associate Professor Kate Highfield. So I think Professor Paxonos said earlier that the brain hasn't really changed substantially for thousands of years. What has changed is the social world that we bring children up in. And so, that goes absolutely for our education system, but particularly digital technology. And Kate's work is right at that forefront. So Kate is an educator and researcher exploring children's engagement with technology, play and learning. She's particularly interested in how healthy technology use can enhance learning. Kate's explored research and evaluations in many forms and is currently researching STEM, effective professional learning, child-led and play-based pedagogies. She's had over 100,000 readers accessing her article in The Conversation over the last year. She doesn't put it on her bio, but I know she's also done a substantial amount of work advising the ABC on their suite of resources for children as well. So,
how did you know about that?
I do know about that. So please join me in welcoming Kate to the stage.
Thanks, Penny. Alrighty, friends, it's time for some honesty. How many people have got multiple devices in their pockets? Let's have a think. Who's got a phone in their pocket? Yeah, 100%. Okay. Parents and grandparents, how many of your children and grandchildren have devices in their pockets? Our brains might not be changing, but the environment we live in is substantively changed. We are now having children growing up in digital childhoods. We are now growing up in a multimedia world. Friends, I'm joining you from the University of Canberra, and I too want to just take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we stand. I've come to you from Ngunnawal lands this morning, and I was very excited that Qantas reminded me of the lands I was on and lands I was leaving. I wasn't so excited that Qantas was nearly an hour late and my breakfast meeting was slightly delayed. I was, however, thrilled that my Uber driver knew that my plane was late and was still there waiting. I didn't have to text him, he knew already. So even though we talk about technology as a problem, in many ways makes our lives significantly easier. So Adam, Sharynne, Anne and Penny, you've given me a particularly hard act to follow. I'm not a professor. I haven't been nominated by a newspaper for being significantly impactful in my research. My little conversation piece went slightly viral. Apparently I'm destroying childhood again. And I feel incredibly awed to be here. So thank you, and particularly thank you to the Royal Society of New South Wales to let me climb over the borders and join you today. So friends, when we look at young children and technology, whether in any of the forms of development that we focus on or any of the forms of brain conditioning we focus on, we have this immensely polarised debate. There will be some lovely people in this room who are sitting like this, saying, "Oh, we shouldn't be talking about technology." And then we've got others in the room who are happily tweeting, taking photos, posting things on whatever social media platform they're on. We're polarised in our perspectives of young children and technology. Unfortunately, the research is no longer polarised about this. We have some very firm guidelines, and hopefully in my 8 minutes and 30 seconds left, I will try and cover some of that. So friends, when we look at young children and media, I'm sure you can see a child in your life looking somewhat like that. I have a 6-year-old. She doesn't have a device. She is allowed to sometimes use my device. We don't look like any of these things because I've read the research. Unfortunately, many families in Australia have not read the research. We have not done a good enough job at translating that research. You see, the ideal way for children to use technology and media is by co-viewing and co-engaging, because that way we can facilitate language development, we can monitor atypical development, we can focus in on literacy elements as children use the devices. But unfortunately, often we allow these devices to become isolating. Can you see the conflict in those images? I certainly can. When we talk about the conflict, though, we have to recognise the positives. So if I look back in the last 12 hours of my life, my device has worked as a clock, a CD player, a book, an audio book, a ticket, a fitness tool, a map. It's been my credit card. It was my communication tool, and yes, I communicated to some of our friends online as I arrived. It's been a camera. I took some photos of this incredible ceiling. My device has been a distraction when my plane was late. It's been a phone. I rang my mother. And it's been a connector. Lastly, and most importantly, as we think about brain development and children's development in the digital space, my device has been a memory aid. I have notes. Those notes you see help me remember what I'm talking about. They also help me manage things like executive function. You see, I've turned off my distractor. It's not on anymore. I've made conscious decisions about how I use the technology. All of those things come to play because I'm researching in this space. But I wonder about your children and grandchildren. I wonder about you in the room, whether you have actually thought about the way you're using technology and who is driving the digital bus in your family. You see, often our friends at Apple are driving the bus. Our friends at Netflix are telling us the types of media to watch. Sometimes children don't even have the option to make a conscious decision whether they use or not use, as parents just hand out the devices. So how do we overcome that? We first of all have to understand that digital toys, technology, is an artefact of childhood. We can't get away from that. We have to acknowledge it. We also have to understand that when we talk about digital technology, we are really talking about screen-based media predominantly. And when we talk about screen-based media predominantly, we have to understand that we've got both broadcast media or streamed media, and we've got interactive tools. We've got these two different things. And you could position them on a continuum if you like, with television, streamed media at one end, and then interactive tools at the other end. However, this becomes really murky because guess what? Most children don't watch television anymore. They watch streamed media on mobile and tablet devices. It becomes complex, doesn't it? The toolbox has changed. It also means that we have a generation of children growing up at the moment whose parents are dealing with a fundamentally different childhood to the childhood in which they grew up. This device, of course, was only invented in 2007 and 2010. One 2010, the other 2007. It's a different childhood. And as we think about what this means for children, for childhoods, and for brain development, I think we need to take some time to carefully communicate, to carefully consider how we use the devices. They're not going away, so we need to really put some constructive thought in. So in the about 4 minutes I've got left, what does the research say? The research says a lot. In particular, we have good usage statistics internationally about how children are using media. For example, the 2023 data from Ofcom, which covers children from 4 to 15 years of age, shows us that children's engagement with TV has decreased. But guess what? Children's engagement with BVOD, do you know what BVOD is? Or SVOD, broadcast video on demand, or streamed video on demand, that's watching devices when we choose what to watch, that's actually increased in exactly the same decrease that television viewing has dropped. So what that means is that the devices we use has changed. We're still watching television. We know that 9 out of 10 children play games, but only about 10% of those games are educational in any way, shape or form. We also know that children who have atypical neural development have different usage, and often their usage is increased. Unfortunately, Australian data is really, really limited. And if we take anything from this, we take the need to have really good Australian data. Our Australian data comes from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and it basically says, yep, children are using media. That's probably unfair. I've been a little unfair in that analysis. We know that children are using media for approximately 2 hours per day, with about 60% of children using media for that time. Unfortunately, the group that I worry most about is the 24% of children in Australia who are watching or using over 20 hours of screens a week. We need to know more about whether or not they're using a screen to know what the impact of that is on neural pathways, on synaptic pruning, and in particular on development in other areas, social emotional skills, executive functioning skills. What does that do to a child? We also know that we've got some particularly at-risk communities when it comes to screen time. We know that maternal educational level is a big predictor of how much screen time children have, and unfortunately mothers who have less academic attainment have allow their children almost double the screen time. We also know that for under 3s, an increase in screen time has a direct impact on speech and language development. It's getting a bit sad. However, the other piece of the picture that we need to focus in on is the children as they grow in age. You see, when we go past just this idea of screen time into looking at what children are really doing with screens, we can see that there's been some positive effects, particularly during the pandemic, of teenagers and young children connecting using social devices. If we keep looking at the negatives, I think it's important to acknowledge the impacts of things like dopamine, and that we could argue that young children are growing up in an environment where we're allowing dopamine, the hit of social media, the hit of the ping in your pocket, to have an impact on development. Unfortunately, the like hunting, that's where people post a photo and see how many likes they get, starts at a very young age. And unfortunately, again, the less educated the mother is, the more likely she is to inadvertently show poor media habits. I think our problems here are really complex and intertwined. They're about language, they're about literacy, and they're about groups that are experiencing adversity. If we look at teenagers, we have to acknowledge things like impact on sleep. We have to acknowledge things like low digital literacy. We need to know that young children, particularly as they're growing into those teenage years, might be using technology for positive social interactions, but that positive social interactions can flip very quickly. You see, when we look at the space of technology and the developing brain, it is complex. So a couple of key takeaways. For me, first and foremost, we can't put the technology genie back in the bottle. Technology is here to stay. We're not giving up our devices. And so we need to be aware of how we can raise citizens in this digital age. The second takeaway for me is that we need to consider screen time for our under threes and screen quality for our older children. We also have to think about the context that children are living in, how they're using tech. Is it isolating or is it a social connector? Lastly, we need other metrics beyond just time. In Australia particularly, we need to know what children are doing on their devices. And we need that Australian research that really supports families. We need to help teachers to navigate this space because we know they're a key conduit in the area. And of course, we need to ensure that we're developing Australian content. You won't be surprised to hear that the American Paediatrics Association and our colleagues in America are quite concerned. They're concerned about Bluey because children in America are starting to speak with an Australian accent. You see, I want those children in Australia to speak with the Australian accent. I want media use caps so that we are building and constructing our own media in Australia. But I don't want any media. I want high quality media. You see, when we have high quality media, we can do this. We can engage children, we can extend their geographic boundaries, we can enrich their lives, and most importantly, we can enable them to do something they can't do normally. You see, high quality media and technology can overcome a lot of the concerns we're talking about. But how do we get to that part? This is the beginning of a conversation, and if you'd like to chat further, please feel free to connect with me. And I'm sorry, Penny, I'm 1 minute over.
So look, thank you very much to our panel. I think it's been a really wonderful sort of journey through some of our sort of very basic cognitive sort of developmental aspects, things like attention, memory, executive function, but also what it means when children get to school, what it means when they have to do things that might not come naturally biologically or things that just haven't happened sort of, I guess, for whatever reason, and maybe we don't know, maybe those are still kind of pieces of the research puzzle we're finding out. And we know that this is a different world than it was 100 years ago. It is a different world than it was 1,000 years ago. And so enabling us to do the cognitive tasks and the sort of the educational tasks that we might be asking children to do, that looks different as well. Now, I know we've almost got morning tea, and I don't want to keep people from morning tea, so we've probably got time for one question before we finish up. Yes?
First of all, thanks for a fantastic session. It was informative and important. My question essentially addresses all the issues that the five of you have been talking about, but if I may, Sharynne, I'll address it to you. You identified that the importance of 11 minutes a day reading at between 1 and 2 or something like that. How important, is that a lost opportunity if those children don't get that? And secondly, is the importance looking at the words at the same time as hearing them so that you can bring language and together? And do all parents today understand that importance?
I can speak to that. The reading. It's actually a really interesting question, and quite a lot of research has been done on this. And I hope this fits with the research that Sharynne's read, but my understanding is that primarily what children are getting by being read to prior to school is they're learning to understand narrative, they're building vocabulary, they're building bonding with their parent or carer. The vast majority of children are not learning to read themselves through that mechanism. And there are eye movement studies, we talked about how valuable eye movement studies are, that actually look at what happens when a child's sitting on the lap of a parent reading a book. And what you see is primarily the child at the age you're talking about is looking at the pictures. They're not, as I sort of mentioned in my talk, they're not naturally looking at those funny black and white things that aren't very interesting. So my summary point would be it's absolutely valuable to read to children. It's a wonderful experience both for the carer and for the child. It's wonderful for building broader language function that will become central once a child is reading, but it's not essential for a child to learn to read, and that is something that really doesn't happen primarily until children get to school and they get instruction. Did you want to?
You were so articulate. I agree.
I might just add to that to say that sometimes we see kids who really isolate themselves early in life with, say the caregiver reading tasks, and they develop wonderful reading skills later in life. But I think what they miss out on is the back and forth interaction and the social development. And I think that whichever way you can engage young children in that social development, the bonding, the caregiving aspects, that's what's most important, I think, early in life.
We've got one more quick question, and yes, please. Yeah.
To both, thank you very much. Could I ask, and it really is to both sessions in some sense, we've heard how important it is to read to children so that they learn language, and that some of them can speak 6, 7 languages, which they learn quite young. Once you try doing that when you're 30, 40, 50 grown up, it's almost impossible to learn one language. What's in the brain that a youngster can do things easily and an older person can't do it all?
I mean, maybe George is the, I can't say the stat off the top of my head, but there's a huge amount of brain growth and development, synaptic connections emerging in the first few years of life. And that just, sadly to say that doesn't happen as we age, and so it becomes harder to learn. But George, did you want to add to that?
Only in the sense that we have more neurons when or 1 year of age than any other time. There's apoptosis afterwards, pruning. Those who found the elixir of life, so to speak, they survived, made the connections, and that the neurons during life accumulate inclusions, things that should have been expelled, and they are not. And these interfere with the migration of material from the cell body that manufactures things to the processes where they are needed.
Thank you very much, everybody. And I know there are a lot more questions, so could I encourage you to find the speakers over morning tea and start the conversations. Thank you very much for joining the session.